welcome you out to our John Sherman Cooper lecture for today. I am Dr. Mike Ullman. I teach history here at Somerset Community College. We'll first turn the time over to Dr. Tony Honeycutt, the provost at Somerset Community College.
Thank you, Dr. Goldman, and on behalf of Dr. Joe Marshall, our president, I have the honor this afternoon to welcome you to our campus. I hope that you have an enjoyable stay here today, and we look forward to hearing from Mr. Willens in a few minutes to talk about the connection with John Sherman Cooper and the Warren Commission. And this is one, as many of you know, in a series of events that we have to celebrate the life and accomplishments of Senator Cooper. So again, we want to welcome you here and help yourselves to the refreshments and so on. I would like to personally thank all of the group that have been working on today's event. Dr. Goldman and his group and the Humanities and Fine Arts, Social Sciences Division for their work on putting together today's program. He will introduce Dr. Willens, or Mr. Willens, in a few minutes. I'd like to recognize in our audience today, we have Ms. Donna McClure here. Donna's here. She's representing Senator Mitch McConnell's office. Always great to have Donna here and her support for the college. Also, we have Mike Tarter, Foundation board member, is here. And Amy Stroud is also here with Ford Broadcasting. So we welcome all of you. Welcome all of our community members as well as students to today's event. So at this time, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Goldman.
The John Sherman Cooper Lecture Series was designed to help honor the memory of John Sherman Cooper. John Sherman Cooper was born in Somerset, Kentucky on August 23rd, 1901. He attended public schools at Somerset and Center College in Danville, Kentucky. He graduated from Yale College in 1923 and attended Harvard Law School from 1923 to 25. He was admitted to the bar in 1928 and established a practice in his hometown of Somerset. Senator Cooper was a member of the Kentucky House of Representatives, was a Pulaski County judge, and a member of the Board of Trustees at the University of Kentucky. He served during the Second World War in the United States Army, attaining the rank of captain. He was elected circuit judge of the 28th Judicial District of Kentucky and served until his resignation in November of 1946. On November 5th, 1946, he was elected as a Republican to the United States Senate to fill the vacancy caused by the resignation of Albert B. Chandler and served from November 6, 1946 to January 3rd, 1949. He was not re-elected in 1948, so he resumed his law practice. In 1949, he was the delegate to the General Assembly of the United Nations and alternate delegate in 1950 and 51. He served as advisor to the Secretary of State at the London and Brussels meetings of the Council of Ministers of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. On November 4th, 1952, he was again elected as a Republican to the United States Senate to fill the vacancy caused by the death of Virgil M. Chapman, and served from November 5th, 1952 to January 3rd, 1955. In 1956, Senator Cooper was elected as a Republican to the United States Senate, filling the vacancy caused by the death of Alvin W. Barkley. He served as a senator from November 7th, 1956 to January 3rd, 1971. Senator Cooper resumed the practice of law in Washington, D.C. and was a resident of Somerset, Kentucky and Washington, D.C. until his death in 1991. Our speaker today is Howard P. Willens, who served as Assistant Legal Counsel on the Warren Commission, which investigated the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Senator John Sherman Cooper was a member of the Warren Commission as well. Our speaker today, Mr. Willens, is a lawyer who has practiced in both the public and private sectors in Washington, D.C. He received his undergraduate degree in political science from the University of Michigan and his law degree from Yale Law School. He served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Criminal Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, Assistant Counsel to the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, and Executive Director of the President's Commission on Crime in the District of Columbia. During his work on the Warren Commission, Mr. Willens assisted the Commission's General Counsel in all aspects of its work. hiring the staff, organizing the investigation, dealing with various investigative agencies, and preparing the final report. Mr. Willens was a partner in the law firm of Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering from 1967 through 1994. His practice included complex litigation in federal and state courts, arbitration of disputes involving foreign governments and corporations, and appellate work in federal and state courts. He advised clients regarding alleged violations of U.S. criminal laws and conducted internal investigations of alleged criminal conduct by corporate employees. On the regulatory side, he represented clients before agencies administering U.S. antitrust, securities, anti-discrimination, automotive safety and emissions, anti-boycott, and consumer protection laws. Mr. Willens was retained by the Northern Marianas people in 1972 to represent them in negotiations with the United States regarding the terms under which they became U.S. citizens and a commonwealth under U.S. sovereignty. This assignment led to a relationship that lasted for nearly 4 decades, concluding with his service as special legal counsel to the governor of the Northern Mariana Islands during 2006 to 2009. Mr. Willens has co-authored 3 books about United States policy in the Western Pacific. Based on his Warren Commission assignment, Mr. Willens wrote History Will Prove Us Right, published by Overlook Press in 2013. And I know that there are many of you here that have read his book. Without any further ado, please give a welcome to Mr. Willens.
Thank you, Michael, for that introduction. And it is an honor to be here as a speaker in the John Sherman Cooper lecture series. He was a phenomenal public servant. It was an honor for those of us on the staff to work for him as a member on the Warren Commission. You have all been very gracious in attending and planning for this meeting, and my wife Deanne, who's sitting at the back of the room, and I have enjoyed many of the scenic and challenging attractions of your parks over the past day and a half. We will remember Kentucky for the rock garden path down from the natural bridge at the resort and park. My subject today is the Warren Commission, and the Warren Commission, of course, was appointed by President Kennedy after appointed by President Johnson after President Kennedy was assassinated, and people ask, well, why was there a commission? And there was a commission because the alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was apprehended on Friday, November 22, the date of the assassination, and 2 days later, he was to be moved to a more secure institution. And in the course of the transfer, a local club owner named Jack Ruby stepped forward with a single pistol shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald. And with his death, that meant there would be no public trial of the alleged assassin and any associates that might be discovered, as there had been in the 3 previous cases of presidential assassinations. So President Johnson had to worry about the fact that in the absence of an assassin who could be subject to a public trial, there were going to be many independent investigations by the state of Texas, by the county of Dallas, and there were members of Congress in both houses of Congress who wanted to initiate an investigation of this tragic event. So President Johnson was persuaded to change his original view, which was to not have any federal investigation, but to leave the matter to local authorities, because as it happened at the time, there was no federal law making the assassination of the president a federal crime. So confronted with these challenges, President Johnson decided to appoint a commission which worked for 9 months and produced this report setting forth these conclusions in the fall of 1964. First, they concluded that Oswald fired 3 shots from the depository where he worked and shot from a 6th floor window. 3 shots were fired, but 1 missed, and the commission was unable to determine with certainty which of the 3 shots missed completely, but they concluded that of the 2 shots that did hit the people in the limousine, 1 shot injured the president, but not fatally, and that bullet also wounded Governor Connolly, who was sitting in a jump seat below and to the front of the president in the limousine. I will return to that because it's a subject of much controversy then and perhaps now. It was concluded furthermore that Oswald killed a patrolman, Officer Tippett, who had been alerted by radio communications to be on the lookout with his police car for a lone, white, slender male. And upon confronting Lee Harvey Oswald, Tippett was promptly murdered by the suspect. The shot that killed Oswald, as I indicated, was fired by Ruby. The commission concluded that there was no evidence of private conspirators, even government agencies or the mafia or pro-Castro adherents or the radical right or the radical left. And they investigated further and concluded there was no foreign conspiracy, which was the subject of much concern and controversy because Oswald had been a defector for 2.5 years in the Soviet Union and returned to the United States in June of 1962 with a Russian bride and one young daughter at that time. In addition, Oswald had been active after his return to the United States on behalf of a pro-Castro organization in the United States that took issue with the United States policy with respect to Cuba. And he patrolled the streets of New Orleans and elsewhere, handing out pamphlets extolling the regime of Castro. And in that connection, the FBI had, of course, been following Oswald with some care since his return to the United States, and particularly in terms of his visit to Mexico City, and had accumulated a good deal of information about him, and the commission concluded that the FBI should have notified the Secret Service in advance of the presidential motorcade, a conclusion that was bitterly challenged by the then director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. So in deciding to go with a commission, we have to evaluate the work for the commission. Depends in part on the people who worked on the effort, and secondly on the process by which they investigated the facts, weighed the evidence, and made their conclusions as set forth in the report. In deciding on the Chief Justice of the United States to head the commission, President Johnson picked the man who was perhaps the most admired political figure at the time, a Republican governor of California who had served previously as Attorney General of the state, a vice presidential candidate in 1948, and the administrator of the Supreme Court that issued many important decisions. The president wanted a commission whose results would win broad respect within the community, and that was one reason why he wanted four political leaders from the United States Congress, 2 senators, two members of the House, one Democrat and one Republican from each of those 2 houses. He wanted the congressman for 2 reasons. First, if you had a distinguished congressman on the Warren Commission, they would be an important influence to persuade their colleagues to forestall any independent investigations until the commission had completed its work. The second reason was that a report that was unanimously adopted by a commission with this membership would win a broad acceptance. You can judge as we proceed to discuss the matter how well President Johnson achieved those objectives. Two members from the establishment were added to the commission. Foster Allen Dulles was CIA director and submitted his resignation in the fall of 1961 because of the failure of the CIA-sponsored effort to invade Cuba earlier in 1961. When the commission sat down for the first time in December of 1963, they didn't have a firm grasp of exactly what their assignment was. Should they simply review all the existing reports of the FBI, the Secret Service, the CIA, and other government agencies involved in dealing with Oswald in one manner or another, or should they conduct their own investigation? After reviewing some of the initial reports, particularly a couple from the FBI, the members of the commission decided they could not rely exclusively on the federal agencies. They had to conduct their own investigation. There were 7 lawyers, and of course the lawyers generally want to understand what the facts are before they make any judgments or arguments based on those facts. So after some internal debate, they concluded that the investigation needed a general counsel, and they picked a very distinguished lawyer from Nebraska, J. Lee Rankin, who had spent 8 years in the Eisenhower Department of Justice, the last 4 years as Solicitor General, which, as many of you know, is the officer of the U.S. government that argues on behalf of the government before the Supreme Court. So J. Lee Rankin was very well known to the Chief Justice. He was widely regarded by the other members of the committee, of the commission. At the third meeting, when Lee Rankin appeared for the first time to meet his new client, there was another person present at the meeting. It was Nicholas Katzenbach, who was the Deputy Attorney General of the Department of Justice. Katzenbach was there at the invitation of the commission, although it was clear at this time that once the commission had been appointed, that the Department of Justice would no longer play any prosecutorial role in this matter. And in fact, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, withdrew himself completely from any participation in the investigation that related to the assassination of his brother. Well, at the meeting of the commission at which Katzenbach was present, he told J. Lee Rankin that perhaps he could find a warm body at the commission to help the commission get organized. I learned on December 17, 1963, that I was the warm body. I was called into the office of my boss, the head of the criminal division, and I was told that I had been volunteered to assist the commission. Did I want to accept that assignment? The conversation about whether I would accept was short, to say the least, because I had been an enlisted man in the Army for 2 years, and I knew what voluntary meant. As a result, I went promptly up to Capitol Hill to visit with J. Lee Rankin and have a short talk with the Chief Justice, who said more than once that he wanted lawyers conducting this investigation who were not employed by any federal agency. And I nodded, of course, as I would, and then began to work for J. Lee Rankin, who concluded a few weeks later that he could use me for the full period of the investigation. So we had to make some initial plans, how to organize the work, how to employ sufficient legal talent and other talent to help us. So we, with the help of the members of the commission, we hired some very senior lawyers from around the country. We had some IRS agents to conduct an analysis of Oswald's finances. And as I said, the people who challenge the commission often do it because they think the people that worked on the commission, both the members of the commission and the staff who assisted the commission, were either corrupt or incompetent. And there are those who don't make any distinction. They suggest both incompetent and corrupt. And so the whole idea of 7 members of the commission and a staff that totaled more than 20 people would all conspire to deceive the American public and the president as to the facts of this investigation, of course, staggers the imagination, but it still is a view possessed by many. So in that case, I listed it in my book, and just here for just your quick reflection that the staff members included a future cabinet member, Bill Coleman, who was Secretary of Transportation under President Ford, Arlen Specter, my classmate from law school, who was a U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania for 5 terms, 3 judges, two in California, 1 in Ohio, 6 nationally known law professors at Stanford, Yale, Harvard, and other schools, and so forth. And the point is that these were people generally of substance who committed themselves to the work of the Warren Commission with the same dedication and thoroughness that later enabled them to achieve these accomplishments within the profession and in service of their country and their community. So with respect to the process by which we proceeded, there was, as I indicate, a dedication to finding the facts and weighing the evidence, and the Chief Justice met with the members of the staff for the first time in January, and it obviously was a memorable occasion for all of us who had not dealt with the Chief Justice on a personal matter, and it made it clear that he was personally committed to this investigation. He had promised he had accepted the task reluctantly, because he personally thought that using members of the Supreme Court to conduct non-judicial investigations or other assignments was a divisive matter, as had been evidenced on 2 previous occasions where members of the court had been asked to take on such assignments, one such case being Justice Jackson, who served as chief prosecutor for the Nuremberg trials after World War II. So the Chief Justice expressed his determination to the members of the staff. He reviewed why he had been reluctant to take the job, but he made it clear that once he took the job, he expected his colleagues on the commission, and the staff in particular, to work very hard to accomplish the goals that the commission set for itself. So hearing from witnesses was, of course, a very important part of the commission's function. The commission heard 94 witnesses in person, and the first of those witnesses was the Russian bride that Lee Harvey Oswald brought back to the United States, Marina Oswald. And of course the commission and the staff were concerned about what kind of woman was this, why did she marry someone that didn't seem to have any particular physical, intellectual, or cultural talent or skills, and was she an agent of the Soviet Union, and what did she know about her husband's practices and intentions with respect to the assassination of President Kennedy. She turned out to be a difficult witness for the members of the commission. They interviewed her in person 3 times, and she was deposed a 4th time by a member of the staff. She had already lied to the investigative agencies on 2 matters of importance. First, she said she did not know about her husband's effort to assassinate retired General Edwin Walker in Dallas 6 months before the assassination of President Kennedy. She also lied that she did not know about her husband's visit to Mexico City in order to obtain a transit visa to go through Cuba to the Soviet Union. So everyone went to the interview, and the staff was eagerly waiting to hear what happened. One member of the staff did work with the general counsel in interrogating Marina Oswald, but of course members of the commission were free to interrupt and ask whatever questions they wanted to. And she was the first and one of the most important witnesses, but as you can see from this list, the commission proceeded aggressively to call on a wide variety of witnesses and experts, government officials, to testify on important issues. The result of this was a very large body of physical evidence. 552 people were presenting testimony, 94 before the commission. The commission's lawyers deposed under oath 295 people, and then several dozen provided affidavits. And that was the evidentiary body of this testimony, and it was supplemented by 3,000 exhibits, and then the expert testimony and analysis on issues such as ballistics and physical injuries and so forth and so on. The Chief Justice made it very clear that he wanted this investigation to reflect the conclusions of the commission rather than have the staff make its own decisions. I'm one of the few people who have served on the staffs of 2 presidential commissions, and as an expert, I can testify that commission staffs always think they're more intelligent than members of the commission. They always think they know the facts better, as they usually do. They always think their judgment is incredibly better and infallible. So they were beginning to express these views in memos that were reaching the members of the commission. So shall we say there was a small protest of the commission members to having the staff assume these duties, and the Chief Justice showed up at a meeting at which I was present with one of my best friends and valuable colleagues, a law school professor from NYU named Norman Redlick, who in future years went on to become the dean of the NYU Law School and was a prolific writer and a brilliant lawyer. In any event, the Chief Justice sat down with Norman and myself and said that I want to get it clear that the commission is making the decisions, and for that reason I have written out on a legal pad, a yellow legal pad, a list of 41 questions that should be presented to the commission for its decision. And the list, which you can't read too well, but includes such things as how many shots were fired, where did they come from, who owned the rifle that was found on the 6th floor, why was Officer Tippett out there stopping people, and generally 41 questions, short, succinct, useful. And so then he turned, after reading from his list, not all the questions, he turned to Norman and me and said, well, what do you think of my approach? Well, now what would you say if the Chief Justice of the United States, having clearly stated his position, or her position, on such a matter, when you were asked whether the Chief Justice was on the right path? So Norman and I took the same course you would have taken and commended the Chief Justice for his diligence, his thoroughness, his inspiration, and the determination of the staff to follow his direction without pause or any hesitancy. Of course, the staff did take the benefit of enlarging the list to 72. But the commission did proceed to consider most of these questions in June and July and save some of the more difficult for later in the final, before the final report was issued. One thing that's lost about the discussion of the Warren Commission is that at the time the commission issued its report, it issued simultaneously 26 volumes of the evidentiary material on which it relied. This included all the transcripts of the testimony of people. It included the expert reports. It included the 3,000 exhibits. And the only thing that was, they came out just 2 months after the report came out. And so the only documents that were not released to the public were investigative reports and other materials that were transferred to the National Archives later in 1964. It was the Commission's unanimous view that everything that the Commission relied on should be made public as soon as possible. And so the Commission intended that the National Archives would begin to process these investigative reports and make them part of the public record. In fact, the Chief Justice learned in early 1965 that the National Archives had a long-standing policy that it would not release investigative materials of this type for 75 years. And when he learned about this, he brought this to the attention of the White House, and President Johnson shortly thereafter issued a directive order to the National Archives to begin processing the Warren Commission materials that were in its possession and had not been made public previously. This is of some significance because several decades later, there were complaints about reports of material not being available, and by that time, in the early 1990s, all of the Warren Commission materials were in the public domain except for 2%. So we expected, of course, in 1963, perhaps naive as we may have been, that every federal agency would cooperate fully with the Warren Commission, because that is indeed what the President's executive order creating the Commission directed the agencies to do, and it was unknown to us for more than a decade that in fact these two agencies had not complied with that directive. Director Helms, who was a deputy director during the time that we did our work in 1963-64, and with whom I met personally on 2 or 3 occasions, told the Congressional Committee in 1976 that he had not told the Warren Commission about the CIA's several years of planning and efforts to subvert the Castro administration, including plots to assassinate Castro. And when asked why he did not provide that information to members of the commission and staff that he met with, Helms said, first of all, the members of the commission and staff knew that relationships with the United States and Cuba were not friendly. And secondly, he said that, well, no one asked me about the assassination plots. And when I first learned this in the 70s, I was young then, but troubled by the fact that he had asked me to ask him about assassination plots when I didn't know there were assassination plots, and that's what I wanted to hear from him. So in any event, Helms was widely supported within the intelligence community for not disclosing these efforts by the agency to the commission. And of course it raised immediately the important question, well, without this information, how could the Warren Commission have reached a thoughtful conclusion as to the existence or non-existence of a conspiracy in which the CIA or the members of the mafia whom they were talking to about assassinating Castro might have played a role. The second area in which we were so disappointed and when we learned 10 years later that J. Edgar Hoover, who had appeared under oath before the commission members, stated affirmatively to the commission that the investigation conducted by his agents and high-ranking officials of Oswald upon his return to the United States was complete, timely, and provided no evidence whatsoever that this man was capable of violence. Therefore, he said, we had no reason or motivation or need to inform the Secret Service of Oswald's existence as an employee in the Texas School Book Depository, which was situated on a street down which the motorcade would proceed. So Hoover was disdainful of the commission after our report came out criticizing the commission. He went public saying this was Monday day of quarterbacking, and the commission was totally without foundation. 10 years later, we discovered that, in fact, after the assassination, Hoover instructed his people to conduct an investigation of the performance of the agents assigned to the Oswald matter. And based on that internal investigation, Hoover punished 17 officials and agents for conducting an inadequate investigation. And in handwriting on one of these memos that we saw, he said no one in their right mind could have concluded that this person should not have been reported to the Secret Service. So again, the question was raised in the public mind, how could the commission make any sound judgment about presidential protection, for example, or about the involvement of the FBI in any conspiracy when it had been lied to on this important subject. So those are matters that contributed to the controversy. As I mentioned, the lack of a trial was critical. It was always hard to accept the fact that someone as seemingly limited as Oswald could execute this assignment without professional assistance of some kind. The autopsy documents presented a very important and early issue. The doctors at the naval facility who conducted the autopsy of President Kennedy obviously made certain notes at the time. They took pictures of the deceased president, they conducted x-rays, and they wrote a report based on their investigation of these materials. And the report of the autopsy was provided to the commission, and the autopsy doctor testified before the commission as to the source of the wounds coming from above and beyond, above and behind was the unified position, and the fact that one bullet, the nature of the wound suffered by Governor Connolly suggested that the bullet may have already exited from the and wounded the president. But the actual underlying documents were not provided to the commission and made a part of the record that was published. And so there was immediately a controversy because of some conflicting reports from the doctors at the hospital in Dallas, which initially tried to resuscitate the president and didn't see all the wounds, exit and entry wounds. There were some statements made by the attending doctors. There were allegations that there must have been more bullets and the wounds must have been different. And so the fact that the underlying materials were not made available caused a considerable doubt within the medical community and professionals generally about whether those autopsy conclusions were in fact substantiated by the underlying materials. So, in addition to the fact that the two agencies lied was critical, and on the issue of motive, the commission failed to settle on any single motive affecting Oswald. There were those who thought that he was a Marxist in principle and that might have precipitated the action. There were those who thought he was motivated by his Cuban allegiances and thought that assassinating the president would be welcomed by Mr. Castro. And there were those who thought that his marital relationship with Marina was in such bad shape that it might have prompted this decision. In fact, Oswald learned of the motorcade path on Wednesday, the 20th, I think, and his practice was to come home every weekend. He had a rooming house in Dallas. He would come to the suburb of Irving, where his wife and now two young daughters lived, for weekends, and he typically would go up to the family home on Friday, driven by one of his fellow employees, who would pick him up on Monday and take him back to work. And in fact, Oswald requested that he go back to Irving on Thursday night, the 21st of November, rather than on Friday, the 22nd. And that night he had an argument with his wife. He was trying to persuade Marina to move with their daughters into a family house in Dallas. And she rejected his overtures, and the next day he left his wedding ring and $170 on the bureau in their bedroom, and packaged up his rifle and went to concealed it, and it was taken back to the depository on Friday morning of the 22nd. So obviously the involvement with Russia and Cuba precipitated a lot of and continuing controversy. Some of that has been alleviated over the years with the falling of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Some of the KGB people testified as to how they handled Oswald when he was in Russia, what sort of surveillance they maintained, what their assessment of him was, and obviously there was nothing in those reports that suggested any involvement of the Soviet Union in what Oswald did once he returned back. And without being too jealous, I can say that some of the people who wrote conspiracy books profited financially. I can report accurately the people who don't write conspiracy books enjoy talking to people. So in any event, the controversy is there, and again, what people forget is that there was the controversy of the kind I've just outlined, and there were subsequent investigations that were designed to address some, if not all, of those concerns. And one of the first concerns about the autopsy reports led to Attorney General Clark in 1968 convening a panel of 4 pathologists to look at the autopsy materials. He called me, and I'm sure he called others, and my view was, of course, by all means, let's get more opinion out on the autopsy materials and try to eliminate that as a basis for criticizing the commission. And those 4 experts looked at the reports and reached the same conclusions that the autopsy doctors had with respect to the source of the bullets and the nature of the wounds. The Rockefeller Commission was established in 1975 by President Ford to investigate some transgressions by the CIA, which had been engaged in a series of activities inconsistent with their charter, which prohibited them from doing certain things within the United States. And in connection with the Rockefeller Commission, another panel of medical experts was assembled to look at the autopsy records, and they also agreed with the Warren Commission's conclusions. The more substantial investigation was conducted by the Senate Church Committee in 1976, which was principally concerned with evaluating the work of the FBI and the CIA in connection with the Warren Commission. The Church Committee did not conduct an independent investigation. of the Kennedy assassination, but found nothing in its investigation that cast any doubt on the conclusions of the Warren Commission. What it did conclude was that the CIA had failed dismally in not providing needed information to the Commission, and that its rationale for not so doing was without merit. They also were very strong in their criticism of the FBI's failure to be truthful to the Commission. But it was not until the House Select Committee was formed and worked during 1977, with a report coming out in early 1979, that we had a government body that was given the task of reviewing all the information and generating new information, if it was available, that would shed light on the assassination of President Kennedy and also the assassination of Reverend King. The Select Committee had technology available to it that the Warren Commission did not have. It did a lot of very thoughtful, useful work, and with one major exception that I'll confront shortly. The Oliver Stone movie of JFK, which you may have seen in the early 1990s, produced legislative hearings devoted at requiring the release of all records being held by the National Archives that reflected the work of the Warren Commission or the Church Committee or the Select Committee. The Select Committee was operating under a House of Representatives rule, which precluded release of its materials for 75 years. So in any event, most of the materials that were missing from the public domain were the House Select Committee's materials, and the Congress did pass a JFK records law, which generated a widespread search within the agencies and public, among the public, for related materials, and they issued a report in 1998 explaining what they had been released and advising the public that only about 2,000 materials now remain at the National Archives that have not been released. And the law that was passed in 1992 provided that all those materials had to be released in 2017, which is approaching, unless the President personally decided that the national interest required that the document should not be released. Now, it's unlikely to see any president reviewing documents one by one, but that's what the law calls for. And in any event, the people who have seen the documents have generally let it be known that they don't see any smoking gun there. And of course, releasing all the documents is not going to alleviate those who criticize the Commission and say, well, all the good documents will have been destroyed, by the time that these are released. So there's really no satisfying the desire for more documentation. If it doesn't exist, you create it in your mind and demand that it be produced. So the last and perhaps of least known of these investigations is the investigation conducted by Vincent Bugliosi, who was a prominent Los Angeles prosecutor who had a phenomenal record of 107 felony cases and 106 convictions. And he wrote several amazing books about his experience as a prosecutor. He got into the Kennedy assassination morass when he was asked to be the prosecutor at a mock jury of Lee Harvey Oswald in London, I think as supervised or funded by the BBC. And so they asked Vincent, one of the country's most foremost prosecutors, to prosecute the case against Oswald, and they found an equally prestigious defender to defend Lee Harvey Oswald. They persuaded a federal judge to go to London to preside. They found actual witnesses from Dallas who eagerly accepted a paid-for trip to appear as witnesses. They found experts on both sides to participate. It was the closest one could come to the trial that Lee Harvey Oswald never had. And Bugliosi was so intrigued by the fact that it was such a simple 2-day criminal prosecution, on the one hand, that it turned into the world's most complicated criminal investigation because of all the conspiracy theories. So he decided he would not only ascertain the facts with respect to the assassination and the existence of a conspiracy, but he would look at all the conspiracy theories And he did that to the tune of a volume of 1,600 pages with a CD with notes that must amount to another 800 or 1,000 pages. In any event, it was encyclopedic in its detail. It was extraordinarily blunt, in his assessment of the conspiracy theorists, and they did not review it favorably. But it was 20 years of effort that is not likely to be replicated ever. And it's a very valuable source of information that none of us who worked on the commission knew at the time, because he tries to bring everything to rest based on what he knew through 2006. He was very complimentary of most of the commission's work. He disagreed with us on a minor point or two, but generally when I met him for the first time in the course of researching my own book, and Deanne and I went out to meet him, and we ended up deciding to organize and fund our own video of Bugliosi's recollections in writing his book, so that could be used in the future in studies about the work of the Warren Commission and the assassination issue generally. He's a very feisty prosecutor, easy to draw into an argument, but we enjoyed very much meeting him. He died just a year ago. So the theories that the conspiracy people are left with, of course, are obvious ones. Oswald wasn't the shooter, it was somebody else. Or there was maybe Oswald did fire some of these shots, but there was a second shooter, probably on the grassy knoll. Ruby had to be involved in a conspiracy. After all, he knew criminal elements. He ran a strip club, and he was there in perfect timing to shoot Oswald. How could that have happened by coincidence? Or Oswald was involved in a conspiracy because of a matter of this complexity and national significance. No single person could be solely involved. So the evidence with respect to Oswald being the shooter is, of course, overwhelming in terms of physical evidence. The rifle here that he owned, 3 cartridges were found, a large bullet that injured both the president and Connolly, and bullet fragments from the car. And these were all looked at by experts who concluded without any reservation that the cartridges, the bullet fragments all came from Oswald's rifle. There were fingerprints all over the boxes on the 6th floor of the depository, which Oswald had arranged to provide him with sort of a good shooting position where he could, for some shots, rest the rifle on top of the boxes. There was the paper bag in which the rifle was carried by Oswald to the depository on the morning of November 22nd. It was found very near the window from which he shot. And also contained evidence that it was the container in which the rifle was carried to the depository. Oswald's rifle found on his body when he was apprehended was the rifle the pistol that he used in shooting Tippit. There were eyewitnesses on the scene. Interestingly, about 6 or 7 people actually saw a slender white man from the 6th floor window, in some instances with the rifle in hand, in some instances actually shooting, and their testimony was very influential, of course, and it was the basis on which the radio communication went out on the police department communication system, alerting Officer Tippit that if he saw any single white man on the street, he should be stopped for questioning. On the 5th floor, almost exactly under the window, but just the room over, there were 3 employees at the depository having lunch when the motorcade went by. They heard the shots and coming from above them, and they heard the sound that the cylinder made when it fell to the ground. And so they testified that was further evidence that we located the source of the shots. Before the commission's work was over, each of the 7 commissioners went to the 5th floor of the depository. And some Secret Service agent or FBI agent went to the 6th floor and dropped cartridges so that the members of the commission could say, yes, indeed, you can hear cartridges falling on the floor above from Oswald's shooting location. So there were, the Tippit killing, and this is a fact that the conspiracy theorists generally ignore the fact Oswald killed Tippit. I mean, that is irrelevant to them, whereas in fact, from an investigation standpoint and from a lawyer's calculation of intention and activity, someone who flees the scene, let's be not pejorative, someone who leaves the scene from the depositor and is walking on the street and is stopped by a policeman who pulls out a pistol and fires at him 4 or 5 shots. Now, is that evidence of some guilty conscience? I suggest to you that it would be used as credible evidence of the flight of a third fugitive. So, in any event, there were some eyewitnesses to this event, and of course, we don't know exactly what Oswald did. We know he went to his rooming house. We know he got a new jacket. He got his revolver, and he left. And we don't know exactly where he was going. And that's another source. There were some members of the commission staff that said he was going to get a bus that made a certain stop here, and he was going to go to Mexico. Well, I don't know. But maybe he certainly didn't have a plan. Let's put it that way. Because among other things, he left almost all of his money except $10 back with his wife. So if he had planned to escape, he would have certainly kept the money to enable him to get away from the scene. I mean, in my view, he obviously never expected to leave the depository without being apprehended. But he did leave it, got a revolver, went out, and we have this scale here. The dotted line shows where we don't know for certain that that's where he came, but the solid line was all he was witnessed by several people along the way, including a few people actually saw him shoot a Tippit. Then he was seen along this route, and he discarded his jacket at the location there indicated up at the right top of the screen, and then he went to the movie theater where he committed another crime. He entered the theater without buying a ticket. And so he sat in the back row there, and the policemen were notified. They challenged him. He tried to drive his revolver, use his revolver to resist arrest, and the law enforcement people did what they were expected to do. They apprehended him and got him to the police station, not knowing he was a suspect in the assassination of the president. He was being arrested for shooting Tippit. So it quickly became clear that Oswald was on the record and was the suspect for the shooting of the president. With respect to the second shooter, there always, from the very beginning, once people saw the Zapruder film or any single slide of this, the most important 26 seconds of home camera work in the history of the United States, there were several slides showing the president's head jerking back, and everyone, and without laymen and some experts said, well, there must have been a shot from the front. The fact is that when the original slides were subjected to careful analysis, there's evidence that, in fact, the president's head moved forward 2.2 inches. And then it was subjected to a neurophysiological reaction from his spinal column, etc., to present the lurching back. And the experts will say that, believe it or not, a bullet is a very small item, and even proceeding at a tremendous velocity could not drive a person's head to the extent featured on the Zapruder film. In any event, it was and in some areas continues to be a source of controversy. The magic bullet, what of course is the subject of a lot of criticism on the ground, that a bullet that seems to be so well contained could not have both penetrated the president's back, exited from his throat, hit Governor Connolly on his ribs, then his wrist, and end up in his thigh. And the testimony from all the experts was, in fact, that could be done. Even those skeptics of the magic bullet agreed that it could be done, and it was more or less confirmed by a reenactment where we see here an FBI agent who was an extremely able agent who helped us to a great extent, at the window with a camera, looking at the pseudo-presidential limousine, which was an identical version of the car. And you can see, not too well, but that the Governor Connolly is sitting in a jump seat somewhat to the left and below the president. And this is Arlen Specter measuring angles and sort of in this awkward way trying to reveal the slope of the bullet that could and did effect these injuries. The House Committee, 2 weeks before final release of its report, confirmed that there was no conspiracy and said there was no evidence of a second shooter. They then went into a staff revision of the report, which was supported by 7 of the 12 members of the House Committee. And the evidence was taken from a radio recording of a microphone believed to be on a motorcycle, believed to be near the presidential limousine. And the staff brought before the commission 3 experts who looked at the sound waves on the tapes. These tapes don't have sounds of shots. They reflect sounds of unknown identity. And the experts identified 4 sound waves that they thought represented 4 shots, 3 from the depository and 1 from the grassy knoll. One of the experts testified that he could locate within 10 yards the location of the gunman on the grassy knoll who fired the 4th shot, which I remind you didn't hit anything. So in any event, this was startling new information. It went against all the physical evidence and all the testimonial evidence that I've summarized for you. And there were some very articulate dissents to the conclusion of the majority. I must confess that one of the brilliant defenses was written by a former staff member of the Warren Commission. But there were some, the lawyers on the commission who looked at this and tried to weigh it against the evidence were unwilling to go along. As a result of this, there was a National Academy of Sciences appointed a 12-person committee to investigate this new acoustics evidence, and they concluded it was without a basis and summarized their conclusion for pointing out that the 4 sound waves on which the other experts had relied in fact took place 60 seconds after the assassination. So the testimony was thoroughly discredited, although the general counsel of the House Committee 40 years later still insists that there was some merit to his conclusions. So when you want to weigh the evidence for and against the existence of a second shooter, in an effort to be fair, or at least provide the appearance of fairness, yes stands for there was a second shooter, no stands for there was no second shooter. So you had ear witnesses. We had evidence from more than 170 people who were there, what they saw and what they heard here. And many of the witnesses heard shots from the depository, but a very large number heard shots coming from the grassy knoll, and some heard shots coming from a railroad overpass under which the motorcade was to proceed. But there were only less than a handful of witnesses who heard shots from 2 locations. So in other words, they have very limited testimony from witnesses as to what they heard, and the bulk of that testimony identifies only a single source of shots. With respect to the experts, as you can see, the experts lined up on both sides. The supporters of the second shooter still rely on the Zapruder's frames reflecting the backward movement of the head. Others now focus on the earlier frames that have been studied now with technology not available to the commission. And then there's eyewitnesses. There's not one eyewitness on the grassy knoll who saw someone with a gun, much less someone shooting a gun on the grassy knoll. And there were all sorts of eyewitnesses on the grassy knoll would say they saw no such thing. And there were eyewitnesses, as I mentioned, of Oswald at the window. The bullet fragments that we have are all linked with Oswald's gun. There's no eyewitnesses or bullet fragments supporting a second shooter. We have 16 pathologists at least who looked at the wounds and said they all came from behind and above. There's no pathologist about a wound coming from another source. There's no second rifle. There's no third bullet. There's no fourth cartridge. So to weigh this evidence in an impartial manner, it does appear as though the weight of evidence is in favor of no second shooting. That's the surprise for the day. And then when you come to the conspiracy issues, as I mentioned earlier, there really is very difficult to prove a negative, that there was no conspiracy, and the commission in its findings made it clear that they were basing a conclusion of no conspiracy by way of saying there was no credible evidence of a conspiracy, because the commission recognized, not realizing how their worst fears were to be realized, that they might not have all the evidence, that other evidence would appear in the future, or deathbed confessions, or whatever might appear in future years that would require a change in the commission's conclusions about a lack of a conspiracy. So the way one wanted to add examining both Ruby and Oswald was to look at all their contacts and activities in the 60 days preceding the assassination to see if there was any contacts, communications by phone, meetings, actions that indicated any evidence of complicity of any kind in what Ruby or Oswald was setting out to do. With respect to Ruby, of course, he was insistent that no one was of assistance to him. He said he did this out of respect for the Kennedy family. He did not want to see Mrs. Kennedy dragged back into Texas for a trial of her husband's assassin. The Chief Justice and Arlen went to visit Ruby in jail. By this time, he had been convicted in the Dallas courts of murder and sentenced to death. And I say anticipating that, in fact, his conviction was reversed on appeal on the grounds that it should have been removed to a more impartial venue, and also that some of the testimony was impermissible under Texas law. So his conviction was reversed. It was set for retrial, and he died of cancer before that retrial. So he wanted a polygraph. The Chief Justice reluctantly agreed to that, and although the polygraph wasn't relied on, it still reflected his views and the lack of any evidence of a conspiracy. But here's a piece of evidence that we think sheds some light. Ruby lived with another man who rented a room from him. Ruby got up on Sunday morning, the 24th, had breakfast at about 9 or 9:30. He got a telephone call from his housekeeper, who typically visited the apartment to clean the house on Sundays. And she later testified that he sounded so weird that she decided not to come out and do the housekeeping on Sunday afternoon. Then he received a phone call from an employee at the club. I think it was something like Little Ellen or something. But Little Ellen called from Fort Worth and said she had come to work the night before, Saturday night, but Ruby had closed the clubs out of deference to the president and in light of the event. She'd reported for work. She now called Ruby, said, I need $25. I need my payment. I have to pay rent. I have to buy food for my kids. And Ruby said he would go to send her a mail order of $25. So Ruby left with his favorite dog. He had 7 dogs, and went with a revolver, which he always carried with him, as well as thousands of dollars of cash. He went to Western Union, waited patiently in line, and at 11:17 he was given a receipt reflecting the fact that he had just sent $25 to his employee to help her handle her daily affairs. He leaves the Western Union, looks down the street, sees a crowd congregating around the police department. Ruby knew, like everyone else in the community, that Oswald was supposed to be moved at 10 o'clock on Sunday. The the police department had advised the public at large of that event, so everyone could be present to witness it if they wished to. So Ruby, being very familiar with the police station, walks down, enters the place through, there was a downstairs path that was very natural for him to take. He inserts himself in a group, and 4 minutes later, shoots Ruby to death. What does one take away from this? In my opinion, it takes away that Ruby had no plan to kill Oswald on Sunday or any day before Sunday, either alone or with a conspiracy. If he had wanted to kill Oswald, he would have been well situated long before 10 o'clock in the basement of the police department. It supports the proposition that it was done on impulse, out of emotion, and that the fortunes were not in Oswald's favor that day, because typically a single shot to the stomach, I'm advised by knowledgeable doctors, including my son, are not fatal. So, with respect to Oswald's involvement in the conspiracy, we conducted the same kind of involvement. There were many more difficulties with Oswald than there were with Ruby, because, for example, when he went to Mexico, we don't know exactly what he did every hour of the day. We know some things he did. We know about his communications with people at the Cuban embassy. We know about his efforts with the Soviet embassy. But what he did every night, what he did during the day, and it prompted all kinds of rumors that he was having an affair with the Mexican who was a clerk at the Cuban embassy. He went to a dancing party at which intelligence agents from Cuba may have been present, and so forth and so on. But there really is no firm evidence that there was any connection in Cuba with people who expressed interest in assassinating President Kennedy. There were some allegations to that effect that we investigated. And I went down to Texas with 2 members down to Mexico City with 2 members of the staff to personally talk to the FBI agents and the CIA agents who were involved in looking at these allegations, and all the allegations that presented themselves about his threatening the president, or meeting with suspects people, or taking money with the expectation he would shoot the president, all were proven to be false and ultimately retracted by the people making those allegations. So the general evidence, the evidence was simply not there to support conclusions of a conspiracy. And as I mentioned, the Select Committee approved and agreed with this recommendation, even after they had the benefit of looking fully at the FBI files and the CIA files and pursuing those lines of investigation to an extent that we could not, of course, but they found nothing there to support a finding of a conspiracy. The fact that Oswald worked alone was something that one worried about, but the fact that he had tried to assassinate a General Walker 6 months earlier was illuminating in this sense, that he left a very extensive paper record of how he examined bus routes that he could get to the site of Walker's home. He studied where he could hide the rifle, both before and after an assassination attempts. There was no evidence that he discussed this with anyone in advance. He had no escape plan whatsoever. He left a note for his wife indicating he expected either to be killed in the effort to assassinate General Walker, or he would be apprehended. He told her what jail he would be located at. He told her what family bills remained to be paid. He told her how to consult the Soviet embassy, and he made it clear that he wanted the newspapers to be clearly informed of his efforts to kill General Walker. So it's a man who had a sense of his historical significance that was more important to him than, in fact, was his life. We thought that, well, if he wasn't working alone, if he had some wealthy power or family who was involved in this, he would have been provided with some money, that he wasn't going to do it for free. And the IRS agents came up with this analysis of his finances ever since his return to the United States in June of 1962 through November 22 of 1963. They looked at his sources of income, what his expenses were, and they came out and were this close to what actually he had. He left $170 with his wife. He had $13, or he had $13 in his hand. So there is the support for Oswald working alone is I think, very, very impressive, and we did not have any evidence of contacts of a meaningful sort in these important steps along the way in terms of obtaining weapons or making the arrangements or getting an assignment at the depository. He began work at the depository 5 or 6 weeks before the assassination, and just that much time. The motorcade path wasn't known until 2 days before the date of the event. So the person featured here is FBI agent Hosty. He had the assignment of collecting all the materials with respect to Oswald in Dallas after Oswald's return to the country and after Oswald had spent some time in New Orleans, but then his family and he moved back to Dallas. And in the effort to find out where Oswald was working and living, Hosty went to the home where Marina Oswald and her 2 young daughters were living, in the home of a friend, Ruth Payne, who had taken the family in part because Ruth was a Quaker and in part because she was a member of a Russian language group in Dallas that was interested in supporting this young Russian bride. In any event, Hosty went to conduct an interview of Ruth Payne and Marina Oswald at his first visit in the first week of November. He was told by Ruth Payne reluctantly that Oswald worked in the depository. But she did not know where Oswald lived. Hosty came back 3 days later, November 5th, and wanted to know whether she had learned where Oswald lived, and she had not learned that. He met and talked briefly with Marina Oswald and tried to reassure her that he was not like the KGB, and he handled, according to his transcript, he handled himself very, very calmly and gentlemanlike in dealing with this young woman and recent mother. So he left, and a week later, the dates are uncertain, an unsealed envelope found its way into the FBI office in Dallas. And the receptionist opened the envelope. It was addressed to Agent Hosty. And the receptionist opened the document. What we now have are testimony 10 years later of what the note said, because the note was destroyed on the instruction of the head of the FBI office in Dallas as soon as Oswald was killed on Sunday, the 24th of November. So the receptionist testified that the note which she read along as saying, "Let this be a warning, I will blow up the FBI and the Dallas Police Department if you don't stop bothering my wife." And she says it was signed Lee Harvey Oswald. Hosty testified along these lines: "If you have anything you want to learn about me, please come talk to me directly. If you don't cease bothering my wife, I will take appropriate action and report to the proper authorities." Hosty said he did not read this note, and it sat in his box, entry box, things to be done, on his desk from the time it was delivered at some date in the second week of November, probably, until the date of the assassination, when he realized he had this note. He said he had many other cases that were of importance to him. How many other cases he had where he could be accused of bothering a wife struck me as always a question that might have been asked. But in any event, as between these two views of the note, I think that the one signed by Oswald is more typical of Oswald. He wanted to be known for what he had done or would do. And I think the direct language reflects his anger at the FBI agent for intruding on the privacy of his wife. If Hosty had read that note, he would have interviewed Oswald. That would have, we think, meant, in essence, that there would not have been an assassination. And so that's a conclusion. The book is titled "History Will Prove Us Right Because," 1.5 years after the report came out, Joe Ball, one of our senior assistant counsels, who was a close friend of Chief Justice Warren from California, called the chief and said, "Chief, they're trashing our report. What can we do about it?" And the chief said, "Joe, relax. History will prove us right." Thank you.